Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to today's Policy and Practice webinar. We're at 10:31, so we're wanting to start on time, and we're just going to wait for a few other people to join us. But as we do, just to let you know that today's webinar is titled Profiling Your DHP Budget. So you're very welcome to come along to us today. So first of all, while we get more attendees to come on board, I just want to cover up some housekeeping, if I may. Just to let you know that if I could ask you in the panel on the right-hand side, if you could find your name and a little digital hand, if you could raise that for me, please, that will enable me to know whether you can hear us, okay? And while you're doing that, just to let you know that in Policy and Practice webinars, we like people to ask questions throughout. We do have plenty of time at the end of the webinar to put your questions to Deven and Zoe, our speakers today. So please do jot them into the panel in the same place on the right-hand side as they occur to you. We will have 2 polls throughout the webinar. We're very interested in your feedback, and also we have a survey at the end. So if you don't get a chance to get your question asked or answered during the webinar, you can do so in the survey at the end. And we will have you on your way by 11:30 today. So that's brilliant. So without further ado, let me introduce you, if I may, to today's speakers. We have Deven Ghelani and Zoe Charlesworth from Policy and Practice, and you see their smiling faces there on the screen for you. It's always nice in a webinar. So just
as well to check that you can hear my voice and Zoe's too.
Yeah,
hello. Brilliant. Thank you, Deven. Thank you, Zoe. So just to let you know that Deven Ghelani is the Policy and Practice Chief Executive and Founder, and he's a thought leader in the area of welfare reform, for those of you who may not know Deven already. He's worked on universal credit since its inception and has written extensively on welfare policy, government spending and employment. His publications include Outcome-Based Government, a guide to maximising returns from public spending, and also Creating Opportunity, Rewarding Ambition, which is an analysis of entry-level employment. So once universal credit was adopted as a policy, Deven left the Centre for Social Justice to set up Policy and Practice. Together with Zoe and also Paul Howarth and Malcolm Gardner, who are also on the webinar today, Deven is a founding member of the Welfare Reform Club. So great calibre of people today. Which brings me to Zoe Charlesworth, who is our Product and Policy Manager at Policy in Practice. Zoe has worked in the field of revenues and benefits since 1985. She's worked for many years as the Benefits Manager for Reading Borough Council and the Vale of Whitehorse District Council. She was also Principal Benefits Training Manager at London Borough of Lambeth. So then following her years with local authority, Zoe worked as a senior consultant for the Association of District Councils Information Systems. Like Deven, Zoe has published a variety of reports and books on local authority business. These include Commons Housing Registers and IT Guide, Local Authority Remote Site Surveillance, the CCTV Directory, and she was also the editor of the LGA publication, The Fraud Book. So that's our speakers for today's webinar. So just a little bit about policy and practice. Sorry, before I do that, here's our agenda for today. So we're going to talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about policy and practice, and then I'm going to hand over to Deven, who will take you through. Deven and Zoe, who are going to talk about the background to DHPs, identifying and engaging the right households, effective administration of DHPs, DHPs and universal credit. And like I said, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and next steps right at the end. So a packed agenda, lots to get through today and lots of really interesting stuff to talk about. But before I do that, I just want to tell you a little bit about policy and practice. For those of you who don't know us, our mission is to reduce poverty. We believe that the welfare system can work more effectively and it can help people towards greater independence if it's simple for people and organisations to understand. Our software helps people on low incomes to understand how changes in welfare policy affects them individually so that they can make more empowered decisions and lead more fulfilling lives. Our engine models how the policies of 4 government departments affect thousands of individual households on low incomes. We use a scientific approach to data visualization that can drill down into individual households and help people to take control. And I know that's something Deven's going to show you a little bit later on today. So about us, also, Policy and Practice, we're a social policy software and consulting business, which is a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully a little bit clearer with this diagram here. So when Deven set up Policy and Practice, he did so because he was keen to ensure that the policy intent was actually put into practice. So since then, and together with the team he's built at Policy and Practice, he's facilitated conversations between leading local authorities and the Prime Minister's office to ensure frontline feedback about welfare reform policy has been heard. In addition, Deven and the team have helped over 50 local organisations to understand the aggregate and cumulative impact of welfare reform changes on their customers so that they can accurately target support programmes, including DHPs. And finally, then, to close the loop, the software that Policy and Practice has developed simplifies the conversations between that frontline advisors can have with customers by clearly showing what benefits they can get under the current system and when they move to universal credit, comparing the two systems side by side using data visualization. A bit of a canter about what we do, but hopefully you can understand that. And before we start, before we could hand over to Deven, I'd like to give you the first of our polls, if I may. So this one is, what is the biggest challenge you face in administering DHPs? I'm just going to launch this poll for you now. As you can see on the screen, so what is the biggest challenge that you face in administering DHPs? We're really interested to know what you think on that. We know from our own conversations with various organisations what they say, but that's not you. So the answers that you have, you can choose all that apply. Is it having enough funding? Is it spending your allocation? Identifying households most in need? Ensuring DHPs are awarded fairly and consistently? And managing the administration of DHPs? And as I say, you can select all that apply. Thank you very much, everybody, for your votes that are coming in. Very interesting. I'm sure Deven and Zoe will be interested to see. I'll just leave a little bit more time, perhaps, for more people to vote. And as I say, you can choose as many options or as few options as you like. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time. Just to give you a couple more seconds. There we go. Right, excellent. Thank you. So now I'm going to close the poll and then I'll share it on screen.
Great.
Deven, Zoe, do you have any comments to make on the poll results?
I think, yeah, they're really interesting. I think it's a great way to kick off. Thank you, everyone, for taking part in the poll. I think it's really interesting to see that ensuring DHPs are awarded fairly and consistently. That's a big theme of what we're going to be talking about today. And identifying households most in need, as those are, I guess, a couple of the key points. We will be talking a little bit about funding and how it's being used, but it's interesting to see that that's quite low down the list of priorities. It's not one we're able to influence directly. Unfortunately, it's mainly about ensuring that the allocation gets to people as effectively as possible. Zoe, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think the fairly and consistently point is always one to be there with DHPs, that even if you have a comprehensive policy, in areas especially where there's many staff administering DHPs, you've got to keep the flexibility for individual cases. And actually, once you've got that flexibility, you're then creating some sort of subjective decision. It's very, very difficult to design that out. I mean, all you can, I think that working with local authorities who've been designing DHPs, it seems that you can design out most of it by a comprehensive policy to cover most cases, but you then need some way of ensuring that exceptions to that are managed and as objective as possible. I'm not sure what the answer is, except to ensure that the same people are making the decisions, exception decisions. It's a very tricky one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as well as having a policy, you need to know that policy is being enacted appropriately. Well, I'll kick off through the presentation. Thank you, Janet, for that generous introduction. We've given the time for a number of other people to join the webinar during that. I thought I'd kick off with something I'm sure most of you are fully aware of, which is just the background to discretionary housing payments. So they were introduced in April 2013 as a way for local authorities to mitigate the impact of housing benefit reforms. I thought I'd drop that picture in there as they seem to be the cure-all or being billed as the cure-all for the impact of all of the government's welfare reforms. certainly some of the biggest ones. And during this webinar, we'll talk about the extent to which that's true. They're paid from a cash-limited budget, and they're intended to help people meet their housing costs where there's a shortfall between their housing benefit or the housing element of their universal credit and their rent. I think Zoe will talk a little bit more about universal credit, but just before the webinar, you were pointing out that it's very difficult with the local authorities you've been to see. It's very difficult for them to identify that shortfall between the housing element of universal credit and rent.
Yeah, and we have heard some anecdotal evidence that some local authorities were actually sort of restricting DHPs for people on universal credit because it's very difficult to say where the housing element is and where the living on income falls. So it's very difficult. It's unlike housing benefit. You can look easily at the eligible rent and see there's a shortfall. With everything being merged within universal credit, it's very difficult to make that decision, but actually it just comes back to the regulations. As long as you're not paying over the eligible rent under Schedule 4 of the UC regs, I don't think there's really an issue, but it has caused local authorities problems. And probably it's actually where your policy starts becoming really important, because with universal credit, that has to be built into the policy. It will have to be built into how you make a decision on housing shortfall under universal credit, because it's just not as obvious.
Yeah, and keeping your policies up to date as these welfare reforms roll through is something that we'll be touching on the next slide or two. They typically go to people impacted by the benefit cap or the under occupation charge, or who are paying rent above their local housing allowance. And I'll touch a little bit on the extent to which they're able to cover those in subsequent slides. They aren't the only reasons, as I'm sure, again, most of you are aware. It's worth touching briefly on the allocation by region. So you've got here, you've got the DHP allocation by region. You can see here that in percentage terms, London, because it's so heavily impacted by the benefit cap, and also has a good amount of social housing in terms of under occupation charge and rents above the LHA. That's one reason why it's, alongside its population, why it's so heavily impacted. You've got sort of, I guess, unsurprisingly, Northwest and the West Midlands with big urban centres in them. But just worthwhile touching on what the allocation is. I think a later slide goes on to talk about whether or not that allocation is sufficient. Before we go on to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the local authorities' responsibilities were. What we found is that local authorities vary considerably in the way that they decide who should get a DHP award and the way in which they manage the budget. We held a seminar, breakfast seminar here with 15 or so London authorities attending. And it was really interesting, the sort of range of people who are struggling and really trying hard to spend all of their DHP allocation, those that were finding that very easy in many ways and wishing they had more funding, and some that were giver-backers, as they called themselves, in the sense of there'd clearly been a direction set by the council that DHPs were there more or less as a last resort, and it was about sort of ensuring people took action themselves. And I think finding that right balance is a really tricky thing. Local authorities have to act fairly, reasonably, and consistently in their award of DHPs, so they can't do, they can't completely go off the rails. But there is quite a wide range in and amongst those definitions. The resident has to actually apply for a DHP, but they don't have to use a paper form. So this is I'll come on to show you a little bit about the DHP form that one of our clients is using to try and capture some of the core information they need to apply a policy consistently. Engagement and awareness are common challenges, and we saw that in the poll at the start of this session. Actually getting people spending all of their allocation was a bigger problem than not having enough money, and I think that's because of this sort of engagement and awareness challenge, which we'll talk about as well. Awards can be challenged. DHPs need to be again allocated on this fairly reasonably consistently criteria, and you also need to keep your policies up to date. So Zoe just mentioned keeping them up to date as universal credit rolls out. There are also other changes like the 2-child rule and changes to employment support allowance, and again that balance is very tricky. You've got to be flexible while also having a consistently applied policy, and that's actually a tricky balance to maintain. Just briefly here, this is the printout from I think I'll jump straight into the quick overview of the software. So we were asked by a client of ours to turn their paper form into an online form. So this is, I guess, covers off some of the questions. Have you tried to negotiate a lower rent with your landlord? These might impact upon the ultimate decision as to whether or not to allocate. So answering all of those questions online, so you're not sort of having to copy, and you've got that audit trail because they're saved and stored. Then you can sort of start to enter in kind of core personal information. So Suzanne is applying for a DHP. We've got her, she's in the private rented sector, we've got her rent here. I'm just going to flick through this quite quickly to get to the elements that are relevant to the DHP. It's relevant here to show that you can look at what this is under universal credit if you were to transfer across, and maybe see how the housing element is calculated here. So under UC, you can it helps you to identify whether or not people are eligible or may be eligible. You can capture information about costs. Again, in a lot of the DHP application processes we saw, you're asking people about their income and expenditure just to determine whether or not they had any other ways of meeting that shortfall. In this case, Suzanne can see that the officer can see that there's clearly a cash shortfall each month. Now, our system has always been sort of action-oriented and trying to empower the individual. So where a DHP might be needed, it's also been helpful to suggest other actions the individual might be able to take, because as DHPs run out, you need to keep those resources available for others. So other steps they can take: move into work, save money, possibly move house. I'll run through each one of these very quickly. Moving into work, perhaps her or her partner could do that. So again, that's been recalculated as I changed their partner's income to show that they can be better off in work, but they still have a shortfall. Can they save money on bills? So we do some analysis based on income against the money advice trust figures to see where there might be potential to make savings. So it's identified that there is potential to make savings. In electricity, they're spending more than might be expected of the average bill. Now, there might be a very good reason for that. They might have a health need, so they're paying for that. They might have additional transport needs, so there might be good reasons, but it just helps to point out some of these points to the advisor. Other items, again, that's sort of a churlish response. Hopefully none of your advisors will put anything like that in, but it's there to be agreed with the customer. And then moving house. So if you found a property at the LHA rate, you could save £76 in rent, but you'd still have a shortfall. So again, other ways of possibly, I'm not sure how successful this has been anywhere. I've never met people who are too keen to move house. But again, it helps to sort of show that. And I remember sort of working on this with, developing this with Oxford City Council a couple of years ago to help them with their housing exchange system that they'd set up. Then moving on, actually what this client had done when we developed it for them was take forward some work done by the Welfare Reform Club around they'd help them to set their policies around certain priority groups. So whether or not they were a priority group, the policy consideration that they'd want to look at. So for example, could they do more to manage the system, the situation themselves? You can select here, the system calculates whether or not there's a DHP, so they've got rent above the LHA. That's what they're applying. That's the reason they're applying, which means that the officer has sort of automatically calculated the maximum weekly DHP, which isn't the same as the weekly shortfall, because it's only there to bridge that gap between housing benefit and rent. And I just thought I'd walk through that because it's a sort of you don't need to use made a DHP award. You don't need to use paper forms. It is sometimes helpful in terms of administration to be able to move beyond that. And this is the printout, so you can clearly see what the rent shortfall is and what they might need to cover. And there's a whole range of reforms to cover. I won't touch on too many, but I think this is the point about needing to keep your DHP policies up to date. So you've got the 3-child rule coming into effect shortly. You've got other considerations, some positive considerations, for example, around free childcare. Perhaps that might help your advisors to think about other actions individuals might be able to take. So keeping this up to date is a real challenge. as welfare reform moves forward. Okay, so Janet, would you mind running the second poll? I think we swapped the polls around actually at the end, so this might be the one that there was initially. Do you want to run the poll, Janet?
Yep, sure. So let's have a look. So this particular poll, this particular poll is asking you, which of these challenges is your DHP budget most successful at meeting, in your opinion? So you can select one of these if you don't mind. A bit harder now. We're asking, is it mitigating the impact of the benefit cap? Is it mitigating the impact of the under-occupancy charge? Is it assisting the transition to universal credit? Is it assisting local welfare support restrictions, CTRS, council tax reduction schemes? Or is it helping sustain a tenancy or to support a move, a house move? So if you could, as you all are, voting, that would be brilliant. A very interesting area. Like I say, we have lots of conversations with different organisations, and this is something that is always a very great interest to us, what people's answers to this particular question are. So just a couple more seconds, and that takes us to a whole minute. So thank you very much for voting. I shall close the poll now, and I will share the screen. And here are the results. Zoe, Deven?
Yeah, I mean, kind of to a degree unsurprising, the benefit cap under occupation charge. We should really have, and I think helping sustain a tenancy or support a move is probably the reference to private sector tenancies and being used to bridge that gap between LHA and rent, which would have been helpful to be, perhaps could have been a bit more specific about that in the poll. Assisting the, do you have anything to add on the ones on the gaps there are there, assisting the transition to universal credit or assisting local welfare support restrictions?
No, I think that actually some of these categories overlap, don't they? Managing, helping sustain a tenancy covers practically all the others. So there is an overlap. I mean, something we're finding is that in areas that move into full service, certainly DHPs are used to fill gaps, while there is reviews of cases where because there's a lot of errors initially. I mean, it's expanding rapidly, and there's new staff at the DWP administering universal credit, some of whom are still learning as they're doing it, and there are an awful lot of reviews going on initially. And at this stage, DHPs can really help. If somebody's got some housing cost element, DHPs can help in that sort of gap. So I think the universal credit one is really, probably on live service, not such a big issue. Perhaps when moving to full service, it can actually be, DHPs can be a useful gap to ensure that people have enough money to live on while assessments are being finalised. The assisting local welfare restrictions, this is interesting. I think that we're meeting some authorities who are, I think it will never be your primary, it would never be the primary thing that DHPs were most successful at meeting. But we are meeting quite more authorities now who are asking for CTRS modelling. And then they want to create they want CTRSs that will fit in with their DHP policy or the other way around. They want to make sure that if gaps are identified, either through impact assessment of all welfare reform, they want to make sure that their CTRS and DHP policies are not hitting the same people who are hit by other welfare reform. So, and some authorities, well, quite a few authorities have lost their local welfare, have closed their local welfare support. And I know that there are authorities who have analysed where that was going and ensured that that's been incorporated into the DHP policies as well. So I think they actually all overlap, actually, Deven. I don't think that there's almost separate categories.
I think it's a good lead into talking a bit about profiling discretionary housing payments and the need to do that. So this is a quote from the DHP guidance manual from the DWP. As I just try and read the whole quote, there will not be enough funding to meet every shortfall as a result of the benefit cap or these other reforms. So your local authority, you will need to target funding to those who need it the most. And how you go to do that is probably what I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking a little bit about. So I thought it's worthwhile kicking off with DHPs and the gap they need to fill. The the benefit cap savings planned for the coming year, 2017-18, were estimated to be 155 million by the OBR, 558 million in terms of under occupation savings. So that's what, 710 million or so. The gap between LHA and rent for people on housing benefit, now clearly sometimes that's through choice, but it's still huge. It dwarfs the other two, 3.7 billion. Given that they've sort of stopped raising LHAs, like on the local housing allowance, aside from in a couple of sort of specific VRMAs from April, that gap is only going to grow. I think it's a huge challenge. It'll be a huge challenge in allocating DHPs. It's one of the reasons why probably in that poll we should have talked a little bit more about that, because there is a big gap there. So if you add all of those up, you've got £180 million worth of discretionary housing payments there to cover 3.7, 4.2, 5.3 billion. So that's as little as 4% of the gap is what they're there to fund. If you only look at the benefit gap under occupation, which is I think how some people think of it, I don't think it's quite the right way, but then they do cover sort of 25% of the shortfall. Regardless, local authorities are expected to turn away up to 1 in every 4 needy households away, or pointing toward alternative support. They're kind of the options that people have. Now, given the challenges households have had with engagement, I think that's kind of just worthwhile thinking a little bit about, and I'll come on to talk a little bit more about that. When we think about making the most of discretionary funds, again, DWP guidance, you may want to profile your caseload to identify certain groups among those potentially affected by the changes. That helps you to plan ahead and establish the level of demand among those groups. You may want to carry out a more detailed assessment for your area. Now, the drivers behind this, as I'm about to show you, is to ensure that DHPs are getting to those who need it the most, and fundamentally to perhaps get the right support to those people. It's not always financial support. Some people can benefit from other types of support. I'm thinking of employment support as being the one that usually pops to mind, but there are other types of support available that may be able to help in the medium to long term alongside the DHP to help you to manage your demand for DHPs going forward. Then again, a consideration we've had from a couple of authorities who've asked us to do some of this profiling is whether or not you've got the same household applying for multiple types of support. So they're getting discretionary housing payments, council tax support, local welfare assistance, perhaps support through the Dropped Families team. And local authorities who have wanted to understand that, I guess, we haven't found as much overlap, certainly not very much unjustified overlap when you look into the cases. But local authorities are interested in seeing whether or not there are savings to be made by consolidating some of the support around the individual. And discretionary funds are growing. So you've got DHPs, you've got council tax support schemes, more and more of which we're seeing having their own little hardship funds alongside them. And you've got local welfare support schemes that are increasingly discretionary. And more you're seeing the same teams administering all of these discretionary payments, because that actually in itself feels more and more feels like it's a developing skill.
I think it's worth mentioning there that, I mean, there's a lot of difference in policies around DHPs and in all this support in areas where the welfare support schemes, local welfare support, is shut. And in that you might have a neighbouring authority where they're still running quite generous schemes. And I think that's making a lot of difference in the policies around DHPs and what they're hoping to cover and who they can help. That if your local welfare schemes have closed down because of the pressure on local authority funding, you're asking your DHPs to do an awful lot more. Of course, you can only help tenants, but you are expanding what will be required from them.
Yeah, and I think also that gap between what DHPs are there to fund and what people perhaps people expect them to be able to fund is a challenge that I think local authorities need to consider. So I'm just going to jump through and show you some profiling and then some analysis from that profiling. So this is a live dashboard that we developed to try and help for Croydon Council to help them to understand need. So they asked us to look at kind of not just the impacts of welfare reform, as we've done for a number of authorities up and down the country, but just to understand the baseline level of need. So income levels, employment, and households that are in poverty. So I'm just going to, from these sort of 36,000 initial households, I'm not quite sure what I did there. I'm just going to select those that are high or severe risk, classed as high or severe risk, to see what that means. High risk households' cash shortfall is more than £100 per month, or they don't have income even enough to cover their housing costs. So you've got high or severe risk households. I could look at those that are in arrears as well. But why don't I just look at these 9,251 sort of high risk households, and look at those that are receiving DHPs. Only 132. So if you think about 132 of those households that are classed as high need, you could really argue whether or not they're getting to those that are in the most need, if this underlying analysis is correct. Another aspect to briefly look at is how many of these high or medium risk households have, say, low barriers to work, low or no. And we do barriers to work. We obviously can't. We can't through this data set look at sort of underlying health conditions, sort of low-level mental health needs. But we can look at households that have a caring responsibility, that perhaps are caring for someone else, or have a carer look after them, or have disabilities. So there's 5,000 of these households that, again, perhaps could be supported over the medium to long term to move toward greater independence. They're more likely to be able to move towards greater independence through work, perhaps, than others. So that's a kind of a live example of how you might be able to do some of this assessment. And again, only 53 of those households are receiving DHPs, and these 53, you might want some sort of engagement with employment suggestions or a degree of conditionality around their DHP award, and track the effectiveness of that over time. So that's some profiling work we've done. The idea behind it is if you wanted to really optimize your DHPs, it helps you to raise awareness of DHPs among those people most in need. So if you look at those that were just severe risk or high risk households, those might be the people that, if you're struggling to spend your DHP allocation, you might want to focus your engagement efforts toward. The second sort of key point around optimization is to have a flexible policy. So tracking awards and their impact is something that might be really useful to do, and I might show you a little bit more about that. Looking at whether or not DHPs prevent homelessness and protected tenancies, that might be something that you're trying to help have DHPs do. They're there to try and help sustain a tenancy, and it'll be useful to see whether or not we're able to do that. And then to help target financial support and employment support appropriately, as I showed a second ago with barriers to work. So I'll just try and show you this tracking.
I'd just like to say that I think all these would really help inform where you go with DHPs. It's actually very hard to do, isn't it? Because all these are longitudinal analysis. A snapshot analysis is how most people will look and set the DHP policy. But having tracking the impacts on homelessness, protection of tenancies, employment, it's really would help you inform your policy in the first place.
Yeah, and I think if I just click through here and just reset, I'll show you one screen that I think really highlights that point that you're making, Zoe, which is the fact that the idea of looking at this stuff longitudinally, I suppose DHPs is one function of the way in which this, your DHP policy is one function of the way in which this analytical dashboard can be used. So if I drill into here and look at, say, tenancies, and you could, I don't think we've built this in here, but you could use this to sort of select a subset of those that were in receipt of DHPs. So if I look at those that are impacted by the lower benefit cap, for example, you'll see the numbers have dropped off. So it's just looking at those impacted by the benefit cap. And if I look here at tenure, I've not done this, I'm actually literally just doing this live. But if you look at those who are impacted by the lower benefit cap, if this were a subset of those that had received DHPs, you could see those that had moved here from the private rented sector into temporary accommodation between Q1 and Q3. So if DHPs had been given to them in order specifically to prevent that, you might want to drill down into these households in a little bit more detail to see how effective that had been. So again, this is the idea of not just creating a policy for now, but improving a policy and the effectiveness of that policy for the future.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Janet, is it possible that we can ask people who are attending if they've done any longitudinal analysis and if that's fed back into changing policy? I mean, I think it's a really important thing to do, because you're actually seeing the impacts of the policy. And I think this is actually quite a tricky thing for local authorities to do. But is that question, if anybody has been doing a longitudinal tracking, could you put some notes in the comments section and just let us know if that fed back into policy change, or if you had got the policy correct in the beginning?
Yeah, or perhaps just ask questions. We don't have any more polls sort of set up, but if you ask a question or leave a comment, Janet, perhaps you can summarise those.
Yes, indeed, yeah. And also, if anybody wants to answer immediately to Deven and Zoe's points there, please do put your hand up and I'll open the mic, and then you'll be able to be live on the webinar. Gosh, that's scared everybody off, hasn't it?
I'll crack on, but Janet, just let me know if anyone does want to sort of share their perspective on that type of analysis.
Okay.
I thought it'd be helpful to break down our analysis for one local authority, and just kind of, I'll explain what I've done before I sort of get to the conclusion, which is here we've looked at sort of core needs that might drive the allocation of a DHP. So you've got the under occupation charge, the average, the benefit cap, you've got the LHA cap, and you've got those that are affected with a high, medium, high, with that heavily impacted by welfare reforms. So these are the groups that you might expect to get DHP. Our profiling allows you to understand exactly how many of those households there are. And you can see here that the application rate percentage overall across all of these reforms is 21%. So only 1 in 5 of those most eligible, most likely to need DHPs are applying. Once they've actually made the application, of those that apply, 88% actually get an award. So again, this is fairly common across. This is the analysis for one local authority, but if I think back to 3, 4, or 5 who we've done this for, it's fairly common that the challenge is not so much the award. I think local authorities are very good at administering awards effectively and fairly on the whole. We've done that with housing benefit and other benefits for some time. There's just a tweak in that for a discretionary support payment. The real challenge is in engaging and identifying those households that are most in need, which I think is where the dashboard, the ability to identify those households and see who they are, can be most relevant. Potentially, it's raising awareness of DHPs among people that most need it. That's the most important thing, and then encouraging them to take action. For example, through the software. So right now, if you look, only 1 in 5 of the most needy households received an award. That's the breakdown of that analysis.
Yeah, and of course, as more people move over to universal credit, it's going to become even more difficult, because you're not going to have that ongoing engagement as a local authority with your population. And at that stage, I think that there has to be strategies. As you move towards full service, there has to be strategies set up on how you are going to engage with people in poverty to be able to offer the services that the local authority can.
Mm. Yeah, and it's important to think about this broader than just DHPs.
Yeah.
I think there's a broader demand here. I think it's probably just worthwhile mentioning, I mean, Zoe, you had a lot to say actually following the event you attended yesterday that was hosted by Curo around challenges that people on the call might be expected to face as universal credit rolls out. So I've got a few bullets here, but I'm not sure you're probably better placed than I am to talk through them, and I'll chip in if I can.
Yeah, I know that the Curo Housing Association put on a very, very interesting workshop on their experience of full service. And one of the main issues, I mean, the key issues that Deven's put here is that the level of advocacy needed on the move over to universal credit is huge. There are an awful lot of incorrect claims, an awful lot of claimants who need the support all the way through. And there were a lot of people who actually put off applying for universal credit because of the verification process. But around DHPs, one of the issues around DHPs is that actually, anybody who's a landlord or a housing association, if they work with a local authority, as long as there's some housing costs being met, this can, if there are issues around incorrect assessments or you're waiting for further decisions, DHPs might be able to bridge that gap just to prevent people having to rely on food banks and having no electricity. And they were giving examples of people with children where only the personal allowance for the adults was included in the universal credit payment. Now, obviously, and some housing costs, but those people were using all their housing, all their universal credit to obviously cover food for the children. In those sort of areas, there has to be some sort of flexibility about the use of DHPs, and under the regulations, there is no reason why they can't be used to assist in those cases. And hopefully it's short term. It's just a thing to move over to universal credit until things settle down. But I don't think it should be underestimated that might need to be built into plans as you move towards full service. One of the other issues that was brought up there was the APAs and DHPs. And there's been so much confusion about this, letters going backwards and forwards and guidance going backwards and forwards from DWP to local authorities. And the confusion is really that if there's a managed payment of universal credit going straight to the housing association, that can leave the household with nothing left for day-to-day expenses. And in that situation, even though when that payment that is being paid to the housing association is actually coming from money that's not just for housing costs but for personal living, the DWP's first advice was under those circumstances, the DHP can't be paid because there is no additional housing need. In other words, housing costs have been met in full because the managed payments in place. But they've now changed that advice and said that if managed payments are in place, DHPs can still be met. And I think that's what many local authorities originally interpreted it as. They originally said that actually the DWP was just acting almost as a rent collector, and that as that payment was not just for all housing costs, it was also taken from other parts of the universal credit. And so there was different interpretations on that up and down the country, but I think it's much clearer now. I think, first of all, local authorities can pay if there's a managed payment in place, as long as it's not obviously covering all housing costs and there is a gap between the eligible rent under the regulations. But I don't think that there is actually a problem anymore. I think it's all been cleared up. Yeah, I think it was just clarity that was needed. There wasn't major confusion a month or so back, but I think it's clear now.
Yeah. No, I think with universal credit as it rolls out, it is going to be a challenge, and I think that point from the first slide really of being able to identify that gap between the housing element of universal credit and rent is something where an analytical approach can really come in handy, as shown through the DHP calculator tool. So I think that's actually the core of what we wanted to cover. There are probably a few points to be covered off, perhaps around the impact of decisions made in Wales and Scotland. That I'm not sure if we've got attended. I can't see the attendees whether we've got any from those areas. But I think the core points we wanted to cover off was the idea of helping people to making the most of the application process effectively and making it something that is easy to administer, but also provides that additional guidance to help you to manage DHP spend into the future, and that need that the DWP have identified that local authorities ought to be doing their own profiling of this, both now and into the future, to help them to plan. And I think what I wanted to get across is that alongside that, you can do so much more as well. So, for example, just that feedback loop back into improving your allocation policy according to need, particularly with the amount as DHP funds and other discretionary funds grow, to make absolutely the most you've got of that funding, given that generally support for these households is dropping away. It's more and more important to make sure that your support gets to the most vulnerable. So that's the crux of what I wanted to, what Zoe and I and Janet wanted to cover. It'd be great to hear, Janet, if you want to run through any questions that were posted up.
Yes, certainly. Just while you mentioned there about Scotland, Devon, I'll start off with that first question about Scotland, if I may. The question says, in Scotland, the bedroom tax is fully funded using DHPs. How do you see the future of this policy in Scotland? Is your analysis still applicable? I'm not sure whether you just covered that off, sorry.
Well, the future of the policy is a tricky one because I think more and more of that will come down to the Scottish Government over time. When I was there at the IWRB event in Scotland, not the last one, but the one before, I remember the minister was speaking about the fact that some of this stuff was under pressure. They're making their own allocation decisions as well. So it basically means that they have to make other cuts to services if they're going to fully fund, say, the under-occupation charge. So that balance, I think they'll find growing pressure on sort of dealing with that balance. Can the analysis be applied? I would say yes. So, for example, if that balance, if they did need to, if the Scottish Government did need to reassess that balance, then understanding what the real level of need was for DHPs versus those that might be able to manage themselves, or versus those where there might be other opportunities, is a way to kind of help make sure the financial support is going to those who need it the most.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question that I have for you is, does the calculator that you covered, does the calculator change in line with our own DHP process?
Yeah, so there are some rules behind it that calculate what the maximum award should be. So those values, I'm not sure if I can just show you quickly now. At the end, this DHP guidance. These values are calculated based on the answers to those original questions and those ones later on. So the maximum awards are set here by the policy that was determined by the local authority. So yeah, I guess in short, the answer is yes. They do amend according to sort of what the local policies that have been set.
Okay, thank you. How does the analysis create consistency?
It's a good question. I think one, I guess it's worth thinking about how consistent it is today if those people that are becoming aware of and applying for DHPs is basically those that are most lucky enough to be made aware of them, come across the right post or deal with the right advice agency that points them in that direction. I think there are plenty of people who are of greater need who don't do those steps, don't take action. That's one of the reasons why they probably need DHPs in the first place. And actually using DHPs as a mechanism to engage those households is a way to help make your DHPs more consistent across all of your residents. I think in terms of applying the policy itself regarding those that apply, again, I think they can be administered quite well. They could probably be administered better by consolidating with other forms of discretionary support, or perhaps shifting toward smarter, more intelligent approaches that build in guidance around actions individuals can take along the lines of, again, those options to improve action, to identify actions individuals can take alongside the award of DHPs. Zoe, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add.
No, I think your first point is absolutely key. I think that once you've got a discretionary system, and you're relying on self-selection to apply. There are agencies involved in this, housing associations and other agencies that come into contact with people, suggesting application for DHPs. And the local authorities themselves do huge, this is where most people have been identified so far, but that's not going to be available under universal credit. Once you rely on self-selection, you're actually relying on the people who are able to self-select, to able to find out about DHPs, the ability to use digital access to find out further information, to find out where support is. And the analysis allows the local authority to have that control. It allows you to find out who actually requires support rather than relying on those people to actually come forward. And I think there's always been a danger with DHPs. It's always been my concern about any sort of discretionary payment like this, is that actually the people who are going to come forward are the ones who are probably, I'm not saying not in need, but you'll be missing an awful lot of people who've got a very high level of need, because they're just not the sort of people who will be finding out about DHPs. And that's where I think the real value lies.
Yeah, I think the only other point I would add to that is engagement as well as identification.
Yeah.
So knowing who these people are and also being able to know a little bit more about them, so you can drill into each one of those households on the map.
Absolutely.
And map those back to get the letters out, maybe personalise those letters, identify, with Janet, as you would say, this is something we know about you, makes people very likely to open the letter.
Yes.
And be a little bit more engaged. So I think that's another really powerful point that, again, we were in Brent the other day, Brent Council, and I think one of the challenges they had is the amount of effort they've put into supporting. They've got, among the highest numbers of households affected by the benefit cap in the country. Yet again, the engagement levels they're getting back can make it feel like a chore. And I think that was one of the things that we were talking to them about, is kind of how personalised can they make that communication, how targeted can they make it, and how timely. So that all of those things increase engagement, and we've seen that grow from, say, sort of response rates of just below 50% to more than 76%, so kind of more than an additional 50% of households responding as a result of being a bit smarter about how you engage them, which is, again, the study was in Lewisham for that, for that study. So yeah, I think hopefully that covers a few things off. Are there any others, Janet, or are we?
I have a couple more, but perhaps we'll see how you feel about ending after this one from one of our delegates. The nature of DHP support is that essentially it is short term. How can an authority remain consistent in its decision making in the face of multiple repeated applications from the same individual, recognising that their circumstances may be unlikely to change? I can repeat that if you want. It's quite a long one.
No, I think I'm going to make. I think Zoe and I can team up on this. I think one point I want to acknowledge is, having gone to lots of authorities, there are certainly some who have done a brilliant job of spending their DHP allocation really effectively, and who have basically been there to really, their policy has been to protect people from the impacts of welfare reform. And what they found is that this has meant that the behaviour change that was, I guess, intended really hasn't happened. And I think that's just something that sort of bears thinking about a little bit. So there is something about trying to manage that demand down over time. It might not be successful after sort of 30 weeks on one DHP, but might be something that's possible after 39 weeks of ongoing support, and using it as an engagement tool for, say, back to work support or universal support and the universal credit to help people just take steps toward independence. I remember one story of just someone who was encouraged to do some gardening. It was kind of a very soft conditionality from a sort of conditional scheme around CTS, actually, that I think Leeds City Council had implemented. It was a really positive story because it wasn't just about work, but it was about independence. I'm not sure I don't think that quite addresses the question, so I'm going to hand over to Zoe to see if she can actually...
I think it's a really, really tricky one. And I think that the breakdown of households into those who have medium or low barriers to moving forward from the current situation, and those with very high barriers that actually might just have to accept or take a proportion of the budget forever. I think Deven's got a very good point that actually moving forward is not always into work, it's not always moving house. That for some people, life can become very, very chaotic. And actually, for some people, moving forward is any action, whether it's voluntary work or even just regular engagement with the local authority or the support agencies, might be all you can expect, and it'll be a very, very slow process. I actually think that the study we looked at earlier in Deven's presentation, where the breakdown into priority, is extremely useful. It means that at least if you can focus moving forward with those who can move forward, it means you can free up a proportion of your budget for those who have no, who you will end up supporting if you don't support. I mean, in the end, if the local authority doesn't support them, who's going to? And there will always be that cohort. But that isn't in most places, that isn't the majority. For most people, they can take small steps and some sort of, with support and with some sort of, and with the correct engagement, you can probably help most people move forward. It is a really tricky one, but I don't by any means think that's possible with all claims. I think it has to be accepted that some people will require DHPs. If there isn't enough housing, if there's a housing shortage, and you don't have a lot of housing discretion, you might end up with DHPs for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's, and we do see that. It's the kind of longer awards as a trend we've seen over time too. I think it's where that's acknowledged. So hopefully that does answer the question. I think we're getting close to time, Janet. I'm not sure if there's any final thoughts.
There's one last question from a delegate. I'm not sure whether you'd know the answer to this, Zoe or Deven, but indeed we can take this away if not. But the question is: have you had any indication from people you've spoken to at DWP of when the DHP for 17/18 circular will be published?
I haven't seen anything about.
No, no, I haven't really. I do have. I mean, just the broad figures.
Okay.
I think I think they come from forecasts.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm afraid I can't help with that one. But I think as you do hear about it, we'll probably be writing about it on our blog.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. Okay, sorry we can't help you directly on that one, but whatever we find out, we'll get back to you on that. Deven, Zoe, any final words before we finish up?
Just a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. I think the questions at the end were particularly engaging, and hopefully this has given you some food for thought. Local authorities have done a brilliant job, I think, in setting up discretionary payments and getting the scheme set up, and hopefully we've given you some food for thought in terms of how we can continue to evolve and develop to meet the needs of your local residents. So thank you so much for your time, and any questions, and I think Janet will talk through the next steps.
Yes, definitely. Zoe, any final thoughts from you?
No, I don't think I've got anything. Just an interesting observation to make is that when DHPs came out, initially every local authority we saw say, yes, we can make objective decisions. These won't be subjective. We can make sure we're fair and consistent. And as time went on, I think most of them would now say they absolutely recognise that inconsistency is built in, and it's managing that inconsistency is a challenge. And I think that local authorities have just become so experienced in understanding that actually every individual, what every individual sees as need, is going to be subjective, and they're trying they're doing so much more work now to try and create objective policies that we're seeing something very different to a couple of years back.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Deven, and thank you, Zoe, and thank you to all our attendees who have joined us for today's webinar. We're really just coming up on the end of the time. As we said, we've finished at 11:30, and just to let you know that there will be a very, very short 3-question survey that is served immediately after I close the webinar now. In the interest of improving ourselves and the work that we do, I'd love your feedback on that. So please do take the very brief time to give us that feedback. And it also gives you an opportunity to ask any further questions and ask somebody to get in touch with you if you've got any particular questions for you. So that remains everything. That's everything to talk about today. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance, and wish you a pleasant day. Thanks now. Take care. Bye-bye.